When you're playing a game, how often do you stop and ask yourself, who am I? No, not in some deep, meditative way like some kind of philosopher/monk. When you play some games, it's pretty clear that you are the main character. But in other games, you find that you're some kind of outsider who is controlling the main character. You pull the strings from behind the scenes like some kind of god. So that's the question I want to ask today. When you play a game like Super Paper Mario, are you literally playing God? When we play a game, it's pretty seldom that we think of ourselves as a character in that game. But we are. Much in the same way that the narrator is a character in any third-person piece of literature, we bring our own flair and personality with us. Sometimes the player's role is more passive, as in games like Skyrim, where an awe-inspiring setting is coupled with the limited perspective of the player character in an attempt to keep the player immersed. But with a game like Super Paper Mario, there is so much that separates the player from the other characters. Between the fourth wall breaking self-references and the variety of events that we get to oversee, it seems unlikely that we are supposed to be Mario, or any of the other protagonists. In fact, since we can watch so many different events that take place simultaneously, and we can control the actions and decisions of all the protagonists, we could infer that the player is a god in the Paper Mario universe. So much of the evidence seems to push us toward this conclusion. Characters like Merlon and Bustovius, who have ties to other dimensions, show that they are aware of the player's presence on some level. Actually, when Bustovius says, "What is this A I speak of? I assure you that if we are being watched from another dimension, those beings will understand," he implies that he's aware that we are able to control the actions of people in his dimension. Merlon says something similar earlier in the game. Both of these characters embody a wise old man archetype, and the members of this archetype in other media generally have some kind of connection to mysticism, spirituality, and the gods themselves. It can be inferred, therefore, that they understand the laws of their universe in ways that others around them do not, and so we can trust them when they tell us that we control their universe. We seem very godlike in this capacity, but if we run with this assumption, we have to ask, what kind of god are we? Although we seem pretty powerful, in that we can directly control the actions and fates of the characters, to some extent, we have little in common with standard monotheistic deities. We cannot change the outcome of the game other than by getting a game over, and we cannot control what afterlife any given character finds. Sure, we can aid Mario in his journey out of the underwear and back to the world of the living, but we certainly didn't send him to that universe's version of hell. So we seem not to be any kind of omnipotent creator. Are we instead more like some kind of polytheistic god or demigod? Maybe like the Greek gods, who can influence the affairs of mortals, but are still at the mercy of the fates. Well, traditionally these kinds of deities, no matter what small influence they're thought to have over mortals, have tended to be the objects of worship in our realm. And nowhere in the game is there evidence that the player is in any way worshipped or revered by the characters. In fact, the flippant way in which Merlon and Bustovius refer to the player suggests that they don't even fear us. One potential explanation for this is that, while they know that we exist and that we influence their world, they are equally aware that there are certain rules that bind us, and we cannot break these laws no matter how much we want to. But when it comes to these rules, the gods of most traditions are seldom constrained in nearly the same way that we are, and they're not often forced to obey the physical laws of the universe in the way that we are either. So if we aren't gods in the traditional sense, what are we? There is a single hint that might provide some insight. One of the fundamental mechanics of Super Paper Mario that differentiates it from other games in the series is the ability to flip into the third dimension. As Bustovius informs us, the player has exclusive control over this ability by pressing the A button. Actually, this ability does suggest that the player possesses a godlike power to manipulate the physical laws of Mario's universe. But more importantly, it provides a visual cue as to why the player has this power in the alternate dimension. When Mario flips into the third dimension, you can see that a mouse cursor drags a rectangular selection over Mario before he changes dimensions. This same animation occurs when the player changes characters or switches to a different pixel. If you couple this information with the fact that any of the player characters, when they go through a pipe, they're broken down and reassembled as though they are nothing more than pixels on a screen, a very clear picture of the player's role begins to emerge here. Simply put, Mario's universe is nothing more than a computer simulation being controlled by a superior intelligence. This may seem pretty obvious, and it hardly feels groundbreaking. I mean, of course it's just a computer simulation being controlled by a person. That's practically the definition of the phrase video game. And it is really obvious that the game is a computer simulation from our perspective. But let's take a moment to see things through a specific character's eyes. As far as Mario is concerned, he truly exists, and the conflict in which he finds himself engaged is vital to the survival of himself and all life around him, whether it's digital or not. From our perspective, the goings-on of a digital world might seem trivial in comparison to our problems, which we consider to be more real. If we apply this to our own lives, however, it provides a terrifying proposition. There is speculation that our universe itself may be a simulation, which is enough to cause an existential panic in almost anybody. But that anxiety is only the tip of the iceberg. This idea may sound somewhat familiar, and for any of those who have heard of the work of Nick Bostrom, a philosopher at Oxford University, you know what I'm talking about. For those who aren't familiar, I'll boil down his basic argument as best as I can. Essentially, Bostrom argues that one of the following must be true. Either A, humans will go extinct before being able to produce simulated realities, B, humans will gain the ability to produce simulated realities, but will be uninterested in doing so, or C, we are almost certainly living in a computer simulation. And no, we're not talking about the plot of The Matrix here. It gets a little more complicated than that, so if you want more specifics, check out the link to Bostrom's paper in the description. Now, this paper was published 4 years before the release of Super Paper Mario, and this hardly feels like a coincidence. More so than any previous Mario game, Super Paper Mario makes the player conscious of his exact role. Despite the emotional story, a distance is constantly kept to keep the player from becoming too immersed and forgetting that he or she is simply an observer who controls some of the outcome. But why? Well, if we have even the smallest amount of faith in the work of Bostrom or those who came before him, existential panic at the thought of not being real is the least of our problems. If, like the world of Super Paper Mario, our universe is simply a simulation, what can we expect of those running the simulation and their influence on our fate? Super Paper Mario deals heavily in fate, and between its books of prophecy and its fixed outcome, we players find ourselves at the mercy of this fate. Despite controlling the simulation, we still have to work within its defined parameters. The implication, then, is that any great being who exists outside of our universal laws, be they gods, transdimensional beings, or simply people running a simulation, may be as unable to influence our fates as we are. Many of us may hate the idea of a life without meaning, but do we find any more comfort in the idea of a life which we have absolutely no control over? Many of us find comfort in the idea of fate. But what about the idea that, at the end of the universe, there's nothing to look forward to other than the rolling of credits and some happy observer reading the words, "The End"? Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. I've really enjoyed doing Super Paper Mario these last couple weeks. That being said, after all this talk about fate and inevitability and all that stuff, I really need to play a game with some open decisions just to decrease my own existential panic. So I think next week I'm going to do a quest in Skyrim and deconstruct that. Just a single quest, probably. The game's a little bit too big to try to do the whole thing. Other than that, usual spiel. Please like, comment, subscribe, find us on Facebook, share the video with your friends if you like it, and we will see you next week.